The fallen leaves tell a story. I was never really a Souls-like fan. When Elden Ring released in 2021, the game really wasn't on my radar. I'd heard the term Souls-like and immediately assumed it was one of those really hard video games that probably weren't for me. I understood the get good mentality surrounding those games, and I preferred to just keep playing Minecraft. But then I saw a boss fight with Dragon Lord Fortissax, and the sheer spectacle of that fight sold me on the game. Well, enough for me to actually go get a copy of it. I played a little bit, ran into the Tree Sentinel, and then proceeded to write the game off and not play it again for a few months. Yeah, I know, pretty embarrassing. Then after a few months, I came back to the game, smashed against the Tree Sentinel for about 30 minutes, and then decided to run past him. It took me a few months to learn that lesson, but that was it. That's what got me into Elden Ring. That's where my journey started. I think Elden Ring is amazing. Even after 2 years, it's definitely one of the best video games I've ever played. With that being said, in this video, I'm going to talk about a few issues I actually have with the game. Most of them opinionated. I don't think Elden Ring is a bad game, and I will highlight what I think the game does well. Yeah, not really, this is just a glorified rant. I don't think Elden Ring is a perfect game. Far from it. But it has changed how I and a lot of other people view open world games. Before Elden Ring, I mostly played open world RPGs, games like Skyrim and The Witcher 3. And if you've ever played those games, it's safe to say the freedom they give you, in a sense, is artificial. Now, before you crucify me, just hear me out. A fundamental appeal of open world games for me is freedom. You can go anywhere, explore the world at my own pace, meet interesting people. The game should give me freedom, allowing me to do whatever I want, for the most part. Now, you probably think that's a great description of both Skyrim and The Witcher, and to an extent, absolutely. And if I approach these games as an open world sandbox, then yeah, they would fulfill everything I want out of an open world game. But these games are RPGs, with a strong underlying narrative. Now, I'm not saying having an underlying narrative restricts freedom. I do think if you commit to a quest, it makes sense that that quest might have a sense of urgency, but when the main narrative of the game has a sense of urgency, it does sort of limit how much freedom you have, not gameplay-wise, but in terms of the game's narrative, which is important for immersion. People like to say the moment you step out of Helgen in Skyrim, you have complete freedom to explore the world. Yeah, gameplay-wise, you definitely do, but narratively, not really. You're immediately pointed to Riverwood and then Whiterun, with a sense of urgency as Alduin the World Eater from the children's stories and the legends has returned to eat the world. If I'm role-playing as a narratively sound character, which for me is important for immersion, my main focus would most likely be the main quest. Of course, after playing Skyrim for hundreds of hours, I know to approach the game more as a sandbox. The Witcher suffers from the same thing, but does it even worse than Skyrim. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying The Witcher is a worse game than Skyrim, not by a long shot, but I do think it gives the player a sense of urgency way more than Skyrim ever did. Especially because Geralt is a predefined character. He has his own backstory and his own motivations. If I was really role-playing as him, it would make sense that my imminent pursuit of Yennefer and Cirilla would take precedence over at least some of the side content that I did. Why does Elden Ring not suffer from these issues? Well, first of all, Elden Ring isn't necessarily an RPG, at least not in the same way that Skyrim and The Witcher are an RPG. But I'd be lying if I said this game didn't have a narrative. The game does. I mean, every FromSoft game has a narrative. There is a setting. How much it matters to any given player, questionable, but it definitely mattered to me. Elden Ring succeeded where these games failed by not narratively forcing the player into any given direction. I mean, you are pointed to certain directions, but it's often done in a far more immersive way through environmental storytelling. The moment you step into Limgrave, you're looking directly at Stormvale Castle. Of course, it's a big scary castle, so you don't have to go there if you don't want. And that's my point. The moment you step into Limgrave, you're free. And narratively as a Tarnished, any path you take from there does make sense. Something that Elden Ring did incredibly well was scale. FromSoft understands how to make a world look visually appealing. No one's going to argue that Elden Ring is a graphical powerhouse. I mean, look at those textures, man. But where he succeeded is in art direction, which is far more important than graphics in my opinion. Made an entire video about this, by the way, shameless plug. Elden Ring truly perfected the open world formula. is what I like to say if there weren't a few issues with it. So here goes my first issue with Elden Ring. Elden Ring's world is massive, like really fucking big. The larger the world, the more content is necessary to make the game feel content rich. The problem with Elden Ring now is, this content richness feels artificial. So for instance, Elden Ring has a lot of main bosses, and a lot more decent side bosses, and they feel pretty amazing the first time you fight them. But after fighting the Cemetery Shade for the third time, it does feel a little overdone. It feels even worse when an enemy you fought as a boss is then degraded to showing up as a normal enemy. I remember fighting the Crucible Knight on Storm Hill, just to see the same guy buffed up as a normal enemy in the crumbling Farum Azula. He was stronger, but he was just a normal enemy. There was also the Misbegotten guy I fought in Castle Morn. Everything about that fight felt amazing. The boss arena was visually stunning, and his moveset was actually pretty decent. But then all that was completely tarnished by the fact that he shows up as a normal enemy, which really rips away the significance of that fight, at least to me. A lot of these repeated bosses tend to pop up in the smaller mini dungeons around the world, and even these dungeons feels pretty copy and pasted. Getting all the achievements in this game was a complete nightmare because I had to go through way more of these things than I'd actually like to talk about. And every time I saw a fog wall, I'd never actually get excited because chances are I knew the boss that was behind it. But sometimes the copy and pasting of bosses feels genuinely insulting. I have to question why they saw it necessary to do it, especially when they're copy and pasting main bosses. And I don't mean like fighting Margit in Stormveil and then Morgot and Leyndell, but fighting Margit in Stormveil, then fighting him again as a normal enemy outside the capital. Or fucking Godfrey. Like what the actual fuck? Why is Godfrey a thing? Just why? Just put something else in that Everjail, man. Not the first phase of one of the most memorable bosses with a slight name change. And there's even more examples of even remembrance bosses getting repeated and reused. And I get it means that sometimes you gotta reuse some content, but when a remembrance boss like Astel just shows up in a random dungeon, it really does make his original boss fight feel a lot less impactful. All of this is a symptom of Elden Ring's scale. It would be unreasonable to expect FromSoft to create unique bosses for all the dungeons, and while I find Elden Ring's scale mesmerizing, at times it can be detrimental to the game itself. One of, if not my favorite part of Elden Ring, is the Legacy Dungeons, which is pretty surprising. Who would have thought that my favorite part of an open world game would be the more linear levels? The Legacy Dungeons are incredibly well done. Brutally difficult at times, but incredibly well done. Now, I'm no expert on level design, and while I definitely appreciate it, most of my satisfaction comes from bosses. With that being said, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy demolishing sorcerers in Raya Lucaria, or tugging my tail between my legs and running away in complete terror, going through the crumbling Farum Azula. Man, those beastmen really hit hard. And of course, these legacy dungeons are a visual spectacle. The views you get in these places are impeccable. It's amazing how FromSoft was able to capture such emotion in their world. If it's not the terror of Volcano Manor or the false sense of security you get upon gazing upon the royal capital, it's honestly a technical feat stepping from the open world into these dungeons with no loading screens, especially after playing Starfield recently. I'm glad to be back in the present from a game that came out a year and a half before it. Speaking of the crumbling Farum Azula though, let's talk about the difficulty curve. Elden Ring's difficulty curve is interesting. So in my first playthrough, everything felt pretty good difficulty wise. I'd run into a boss, get stomped, and depending how badly I got stomped, I'd do one of two things. Either smash myself into the boss until I finally put him down, or run away, level up a little, then smash myself into the boss until I finally put him down. But then I got to the mountaintops of the giants, and well, this region of the map just felt really weird. Everything in this region hits really fucking hard. It genuinely made me feel like I was severely underleveled. But then on another playthrough, when I got to the mountaintops, I was kicking ass. The region wasn't nearly as difficult as I'd remembered it, and the fire giant wasn't nearly as much of a pain. I mean, still a pain, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Well, turns out, the reason why it felt easier on my second playthrough was my build was different. I was now using a more intelligent focus build, but more importantly, not only did I get my hands on the Mimic tier, but also figure out how to upgrade Spirit Ashes, which honestly trivializes a lot of the game's bosses. It was even more extreme with the crumbling Farum Azula, as it felt genuinely unfair my first time going through it. But there is still an issue here, and the issue is that Elden Ring is just not very well balanced. Depending on your build, the game can either be incredibly frustrating or really easy. I had friends who told me how much they struggled with Radagon, but I killed the guy in like 3 tries. Not because I'm like some incredible gamer or something, but I was already at the mountaintops of the giants by the time I actually went back and fought him. So it turns out I was just completely overleveled. I think these issues are another symptom of Elden Ring's scale. Enemies don't scale with the player, so you might be completely over or under leveled for certain encounters. Of course, this had some upsides. I feel like most people ventured into Caelid and felt completely overwhelmed by that hellscape, which would never have happened if enemies scaled with your level. And like that, it's really satisfying when you return to a region after going up a few levels and being completely overpowered, bullying the monsters that once bullied you. Because of Elden Ring's size and scale, it would be impossible for them to perfectly balance this game as to make sure it's not too easy or hard. They couldn't predict when the player would encounter anything, thus would scale every boss and enemy at the level they think the player should be, like in their previous titles. And because of the scale and freedom that Elden Ring provides, the likelihood that any given player would encounter something too early and be completely underleveled or too late and completely overleveled is significantly higher. They scale different regions based on what level they expected the players to be at that point in the game. The thing is, some places are accessible immediately after stepping out of the Stranded Graveyard, yet aren't meant to be played at level 10. They expect you to level up some more, come back later, which is a lesson they try to teach you the moment you enter Limgrave, running into the tree Sentinel, which took me a few months to beat. God, I suck at this game. Balancing the later game might seem easier because it's a lot less open. The game basically becomes a glorified boss rush after the Fire Giant, especially if you know your way around the crumbling Farum Azula. But I actually think the later game might have been a lot harder to balance because they had to take into account the side content that the player did, if any. I think it feels so difficult for a lot of people because they balanced it not only on the level they expected you to be, but also on your overall game understanding and ability to utilize the utility the game provided. All the lessons you learn throughout the game needs to be employed to overcome the challenge the later game presents. But despite all this, I still think the later game is at times sort of unreasonable. But again, it's also sort of dependent on the build you're running. And of course, all of this gets me into my final assessment, the bosses. Elden Ring has a lot of bosses, like a ridiculous amount. Even looking past the constantly repeated bosses, it's still more than any Souls game. But does this quantity maintain that FromSoft quality? Well, absolutely. More than that, because of Elden Ring's design and open-endedness, only 8 of the game's 11 required bosses are actually mandatory. So let me explain. So to beat Elden Ring, you technically only need to beat 11 bosses, though the average player will probably beat 12. That's assuming they choose to stick to the main narrative and not go off on side adventures, which is quite likely. You need 2 great runes to get into the capital, and while most players would beat Margit and get their first great rune from Godrick, then visit and bully Rennala, you could honestly just visit Radagon instead, skipping Margit and Godrick, instead only technically needing to beat 2 bosses. From there, you need to beat the Draconic Tree Sentinel, but he's technically also not mandatory, as you could get to the capital through the Deep-Root Depths, though this would mean beating both the Mimic and the Gargoyles, which I hate. I'll get into that in a minute, and this is honestly far more tedious. After the Draconic Tree Sentinel, for the most part, all the bosses are mandatory. But taking all of that into account, all the main bosses is still sort of hard to define. For me, it was all the remembrance bosses and all the bosses that were necessary to get to them. Elden Ring has a total of 24 main bosses by my definition, 15 remembrance bosses and 9 more required just to get to them. And of course, that's not counting the countless mini dungeons, caves, and everjails that have bosses, often the ones that are repeated. Now, of all of these 24 bosses, I only consider 3 of them to be actually bad. And of those 3, only 2 of them are technically mandatory to complete the game. So, who are these guys? Well, first, there's this asshole. I genuinely think the Fire Giant is just a horrible boss. Of course, that's an opinion. But I honestly think this boss has no redeeming factors, and while I respect the spectacle of the fight, it by no means makes up for how bad it is. Of course, in my opinion. FromSoft's games have often been described as a dance. Learning a boss's movesets and understanding how to dodge and punish every opening you can. You know what's not a fucking dance though? Wailing at this motherfucker's ankles. Like, that's literally the entire first phase of the fight. Every once in a while, you gotta run away because there's a fireball coming after your ass. And of course, this guy is so big that you can never really tell what the fuck he's doing. You're just tickling his ankles with a greatsword the entire time. And then there's his second phase. That's a complete fucking gimmick. If you got a ranged intelligence build, it might not be a complete pain, as this guy stops taking reasonable damage from all places except his hands and his giant chest eye god thingy. So the entire second phase of this fight for melee builds is just you tickling his ball sacks. I mean, I think he's the least offensive of the 3, but still, man, hate this guy. And of course, that is an opinion you're inclined to disagree. I know there's probably a few Fire Giant fans out there, and you know, man, more power to you. I don't think it's a coincidence that what I consider to be the worst two bosses in the game are both duo boss fights. Where people tout the perfection that is Ornstein and Mohg, I definitely think FromSoft might have forgotten that magic, cause I'ma tell ya, Elden Ring doesn't have a single decent duo boss fight. And this being my first Souls-like, it turned me off from duo boss fights in general. Trying to fight these two gargoyles solo is actually a fucking nightmare, as they're not coordinated at all. There's also no synergy in fighting them, no rhythm, no dance. It doesn't help that the boss arena isn't level at all, so you're fighting the boss room along with these guys. I will say though, the second one doesn't show up until halfway into the fight, so you kind of just have to get the first one down before he shows up, although unless you're over leveled, this isn't very likely. And yeah, this is just definitely one of those fights where it's a lot better when you're completely over leveled. It's almost like FromSoft expected us to summon in this fight, which perfectly transitions me into the boss fight I consider to be the worst in the entirety of Elden Ring. Now, before that, a few not so honorable mentions. This worm is an actual nightmare. It doesn't help that for some reason FromSoft almost always decides to put this guy in a tiny little boss room, despite him being one of the largest bosses in the game. And then the fact that this guy can just zip around at supersonic speeds. The real difficulty of this fight is telling what's going on at any given moment while the camera tries to give you a seizure. Then there's also the magma worm. I think my disdain from this boss comes from my first encounter with it. One where FromSoft decided to put this thing that is technically a dragon in a tiny ass dungeon. I mean, come on. And then this guy just zips around vomiting magma all over the place. And of course, being in this confined space means the real fight is with the camera and not the boss. The Godskin Duo. Now, individually, these bosses are actually pretty good. I remember fighting the Godskin Apostle for the first time in the windmill village of Dominilla atop a hill. The atmosphere of that fight was incredible. And I must say, the Godskin Duo as a concept is actually pretty sick, but FromSoft done fumbled it. These bosses do not complement each other at all, and they hit incredibly hard. Rolling away from one attack might put you right into another. Again, it's almost like FromSoft wants us to summon. And yeah, if you summon your Mimic tier, the fight becomes trivial, but the difficulty of these guys makes it almost a necessity, or you could just cheese them with sleeping pots. The fat guy has this really annoying rolling attack that's a bitch to dodge. And these guys have one combined health bar, so you gotta kill them like a whole bunch of times for them to actually stay dead. The goal is to just get one dead and just fight one at a time, but they can just summon one in the middle of the fight. So in a lot of ways, it's just RNG, man. But aside from these bosses, Elden Ring has some absolutely amazing ones. Like I said, I think the spectacle of Fortissax is honestly one of the best in this series. And the final battle with Radagon is absolutely amazing. The music slaps, everything slaps, the Elden Beast shows up and fuck that guy, but otherwise, absolutely amazing. And then there's my favorite boss, Godfrey. I remember fighting him at first as Goldfrey and getting absolutely stomped, but then I fought him over and over until I actually learned his moveset. And then fighting the actual Godfrey felt absolutely amazing until his second phase where he just launched me into the fuck. Overall, after the past 2 years of play and countless playthroughs, I must say Elden Ring is a darn good game. And while it's definitely not perfection, that does make me sort of excited for the next Souls-like FromSoft comes out with. And especially with Shadow of the Erdtree looming over the horizon, it's safe to say we haven't seen the last of this masterpiece.
The fallen leaves tell a story of how a tarnished became Elden Lord. In our home, across the fog, the lands between.